type of very crucial issue about accounting procedures, bankruptcy procedures, all of the elements which are required to make an effective, sophisticated international economy function.
I might tell you, you could have used that you won't get to the majors unless you have a curveball, instead of hitting it, that you have one, because I found that out. I didn't have a curveball, so I didn't make it. I just made it to the minors. No, I was a pitcher.
Mr. Chairman, given all this concern, we're thinking about asking when the season ends, Mark McGuire to go to a number of emerging markets to serve as a bank regulator, so that they will be ready to respond.
Great.
If I could just briefly supplement the chairman's answer. Let me first just thank you for your kind words, which mean a lot at a time when we're working on some very challenging problems. These are clearly, as I think the chairman's comments suggested, issues of great complexity, and there is no single structure or no single item that is going to be a silver bullet with respect to these problems. But what I think will come out of the meeting that the chairman and secretary host will be understandings on the need quite quickly to put in place agreements that will lead to far more transparency, that will lead to established codes of best practice and surveillance to identify when they are being followed in the banking area, that will put a great deal of pressure on countries to put in place more satisfactory bankruptcy laws and other laws to provide for security in lending. And then I think there will be processes that will consider some of what are, in a sense, broader questions that expand the reach of the inquiry by asking how the IMF can, and the international financial institutions generally, can be more effective institutions. We know they need to be more transparent. We know they need to be more accountable. But we've seen, as your question, which I thought got exactly at the right issue, pointed out, we've seen a different kind of crisis with the capital account withdrawal leading to economies being very much disrupted. And traditional modes of support may well not be appropriate to those kinds of crises. And that will be an important part of the inquiry. There is also the question on the upside as well as on the downside of how and if there are ways in which consistent with maintaining free markets, we can avoid the excess accumulations that typically precede the problems, and that will figure in the inquiry as well. But I would expect to see some progress on the transparency, banking, and creditor involvement areas to be something we're working on in the quite near term, and then in the longer term, some of these larger questions will be pursued.
Thank you both. Senator Lautenberg.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to spend a couple minutes while we're all assembled here and take issue with our colleague from Texas, because my remarks don't have to be characterized. I think I speak English, and therefore, what the effects of what I intend need not be translated. And I would say this in response to the relatively sardonic tone. We talk about Y2K, and we haven't solved the problem, so therefore, what the hell do we have to solve it for? We haven't solved it to now. We knew it was going to be there. And in terms we found ourselves in Bosnia, what a surprise. What a surprise. There are people over there whose lives depend on our continuing to support the effort. And there is nothing that passes as an emergency unless, and I remind the senator, and he's a fairly astute guy, that nothing gets declared emergency unless both the Congress and the President agree. And so therefore, that's where we are with this emergency package, which includes $400 million to buy oil for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And that the White House requested $7 billion, $8 billion in fiscal year 99 emergency appropriations. So the senator can dismiss all he wants, the fact that we're up to our eyeballs in Bosnia, or that we are on the verge of a crisis with YK2. And anyone who doesn't know that really ought to go to take a primer in that area and find out what could happen if we fail to do it. So this patient's in the emergency room, and we're being asked to provide oxygen. Not that we should have known before that this guy was really sick. So here, that's where we are, and I don't characterize the senator's intent, and I'd appreciate if the courtesy could flow both ways. The fact of the matter is that if we have a tax cut, Mr. Chairman, that tax cut of $80 billion for 5 years, which is generally proposed, it's talked about anyway, rumored, let's say, that has kind of a lifetime effect of eating into any surpluses that might evolve. Does that sound right, based on where we are now, based on the projected budget surpluses that we have?
Is that addressed to me, Senator?
You're still the chairman?
Arithmetically, if you reduce taxes, the presumption will be that unless it's a tax cut which is growth-producing, which I fear this one is not, that it will reduce the surplus.
It will reduce the surplus. And is it, I think both of you are aware of the fact that if we have emergency spending, that it does not, in fact, raise the discretionary caps. That's part of the budget law. Is that not so, Mr. Secretary?
You are much more of an authority on the budget procedures than I, so I wouldn't presume to make a judgment.
On this one, please take my word for it. And,
happy to.
That we do not raise the caps when it's emergency spending that has offset. But if we do go into the large tax cut, and I don't mind giving people their own money back, but I want to make sure that it's there in Social Security for future generations. I want to make sure that people aren't disappointed when their 401ks slip through the hole when, in fact, the stock market surrenders much of its gain. Or people who just bought houses and have mortgages don't see their values suddenly beginning to decline. So, therefore, the pledge that the President made, and that we in the Budget Committee generally supported, and I'll not speak for the whole Budget Committee, was that we would pay down as much as we could the debt, relieve Social Security of its threat to insolvency. But any tax burden, any tax cut that we put into effect has, again, kind of a permanent life unless specifically changed, whereas an emergency program does not. It's a very specific thing. It ends at the time that, as a matter of fact, immediacy is one of the tests that an emergency declaration has to have. And so if we're going to discuss these things, we ought to discuss it based simply on the facts and not on the characterization. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you got to answer a lot of questions during that discussion.
I think I'm supposed to answer that.
Go ahead.
Well, Mr. Chairman, first of all, my point is we knew the year 2000 was coming. In fact, since the calendar was set out 5,000 years ago, we knew there was going to be a year 2000.
Chairman Greenspan and I knew that the company we both served on the board of did their work.
Now listen to the senator, even though what he said didn't make a lot of sense to me, I listened to it very carefully. I hope he'll do me the same courtesy. The point is, we're spending $1.7 trillion this year. And my point is to suggest that it's now an emergency, that the year 2000 is coming, and that the President couldn't put it in his budget is outrageous, and it is an abuse of the budget process. We knew we were going to be in Bosnia. The President has never asked for a regular appropriation for Bosnia. We cheat the budget process by treating it as an emergency. So my point is, and I don't understand, people are going to be disappointed if the money's not there for Social Security if we cut taxes, but they're not going to be disappointed if we spend the money. Now, my suggestion is we don't do either. My suggestion is we put Social Security first. But I don't understand. The president and those who support him are hell-bent not to cut taxes, but when it comes to spending money, they lack the same resolve. Now, I have the same resolve on both sides. And in terms of doing these other things like the emergency in agriculture, I would be perfectly willing to cut other programs. I certainly don't want to spend $7 billion. Now, let me get to the point I wanted to make. I see, maybe it's just I see a silver lining in every storm cloud, but I see something good out of the Asian economic crisis. And I wanted to mention it and get your response to it. First of all, I think that the Asian crisis has done something that is important for the whole world and especially important to America. And that is it has discredited crony capitalism. It has discredited economic planning. And I can remember on this very committee, the Banking Committee, and the Finance Committee, not 5 years ago when people were talking about why can't we be more like Japan? And I have to believe that in the end, when this thing works all the way through, despite the adjustment process, that if we discredit crony capitalism and state-directed capitalism for a quarter of a century in the world as a result of this problem, that in the end, this is going to be a good thing and not a bad thing. That's first point. Let me make the second one so I can cheat on the time like everybody else. Because I want both of you to respond to that. Second point is, in the end, we might get the $18 billion for IMF. I want to do it because I want to buy the insurance policy. I'm not totally convinced. But we're going to have hard and fast rules that the IMF is going to have to adopt and make its policy about open markets, transparency, bankruptcy, and crony capitalism. And in the end, the administration needs to start getting ready for the fact that in order to get the $18 billion, we're going to have very, very tough conditions, if we're lucky in getting the $18 billion, that are going to go with it. And in the end, the IMF is going to have to officially change its policy to be able to take this money. I'd like to get your reaction to both my good news and the IMF. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Senator, I wholly agree with your first appraisal. I'll let the Secretary cope with your second appraisal. With the really quite marked improvement in various different types of technologies, we have created effectively the possibility of, as I said several times this afternoon, a very efficient and very effective global economic financial system. To function in it will require that you have world-class institutions. And crony capitalism clearly is not a type of organization which fosters that. A number of people have argued that there's been a very severe retrenchment in East Asia standard of living, which is true. But I think it's important to recognize it's 1/6 of what was gained in the last 10 years. That most of what has been gained is still there, and it is the consequence of very substantial movement in capitalist-type market structures. Part of it was inoperative, which was the crony capitalism part, and that ultimately prevented the system from continuing full-blown indefinitely. But we should not detract from the extent to which they, all of them, have set up a very effective set of institutions relative to what they had 20, 30 years ago. So they may not be, as I said before, world class or major league, but they're pretty good AAA ball. And it doesn't require all of that much to alter their institutions, to bring them up, to enable everybody to be dealing in a manner in which we do not get these dramatic shifts of flows of funds and investment because of inadequate infrastructure, an infrastructure which is vulnerable to major changes. If everybody is well situated, then the markets will not be ricocheting back and forth. They will be moving forward in a very effective manner. And as a consequence of that, I fully agree with your view that there is the possibility of all of this emerging into a much more effective 21st century world economy.
Senator Graham, I would share your judgment very strongly that these countries will emerge best from this if out of this they become more transparent, they develop institutions with more integrity, the rule of law becomes, rather than arbitrary relationships, becomes a larger part of finance. I think that is very important. I would say, and as I thought about your reference to these committees' discussions of Japan five years ago, it occurred to me that while our economy, as the chairman explained, is doing very well, and I think our system has enormous amounts to recommend it. I think it is a mistake for any of us not to remember that we can't predict the future, that problems will come in the distant future, and to ever think that we have found the ultimate truth and right in economic policy debates, and that as we discuss other countries' problems with them, we need to recognize that they have different traditions and different situations, and that has to be an aspect of the discussion as well. On the IMF, I think we have a recognition. There's a lot in the IMF that I think there is a growing sense needs to be addressed and changed, and certainly that'll be part of any discussion as we move to the end game here in the legislative process. I would just say two things, though. One is I hope that everyone will remember that there are important questions of balance here that go into it. On the one hand, crony capitalism is every bit as much of a problem as you said it was in your comments. On the other hand, there's a limit to how radically an economy can be transformed under conditions from abroad overnight without inviting a very large political backlash. And that kind of thing has to be balanced in the design of programs. And in my testimony, I noted a number of other aspects where it seems to me we need to find the right balance and make it possible for the IMF to find the right balance. I would say that whatever process is chosen going forward, and I recognize Congress's desire and respect the importance of energizing the process, that I think with everything that is happening in the world, it is important that we find a process that both insists on change but also provides for the possibility of the financial support being available at the moment when it is needed, which unfortunately, in light of what has happened, is now.
Thank you very much. Senator Graham, I want to say that I believe your optimism is accurate, and I think all we're urging is that in the process of trying to be helpful, that we recognize we can't, if we make the market work better, that's how how we'll be helpful. If we put rules in and other things that make it not work, because some people think you want to regulate everything, some country or some dictator, it's not going to work. It did work rather well, even with cronyism, in terms of some growth and prosperity. So the world might come out of it much better, and I agree with you.
Well, and the point that I just would add to what both of our excellent witnesses said is that this is good for us. I mean, the point is it's going to be a quarter of a century before we're going to have anybody on this committee or any other committee say, why don't we model our economy after the way Japan used to do business? And I never will forget, Mr. Chairman, being in a meeting with a Republican president and a Republican cabinet member who were trying to convince me we ought to invest in high-definition television, something the Japanese squandered a fortune on. We invested no public money. Our technology dominates the world market, not theirs. And again, I think this is not only will Asia learn, but the world will learn. We will learn. Some demagogue yet unborn will not be heard as a result of this lesson.
Now, I don't think that you really have to get carried away. You've done an excellent job. No, I think we've had enough of you for the day, and we're now going to proceed to Senator Grams.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've run out of questions, but I can't pass up the opportunity to at least make a political statement in defense of tax cuts. When we're talking about a piddly $80 billion, it sounds like a lot of money, but you stretch it over 5 years, and every American, it's less than $4 a month. That's not real tax relief for the American taxpayer. It's less than a penny of what we expect in surpluses. And I always like to compare it to President Reagan's proposed tax cut back in 1980. In today's dollars, it would be about $1.7 trillion, and that was times during deficits, not in times of prosperity like we have today. And I think that if there is an overcharge to the consumer, the least we could do is give it back and not find new ways to expand the government to absorb it. So with that, if you have any comment, maybe I'm wrong on my figures, but otherwise, that's all I wanted to do is make a defense of that. Thank you.
Let me say we have some questions with reference to Central and South America, which we didn't have enough time to ask about. And we're fully aware that those economies, in terms of proportionality, are much more important to the American economy than Russia. We dealt with Russia because it sort of led an unexpected consequence, and people are wondering what's happening. But we'll submit those to you, and at your convenience, if you'll answer them. Thank you very much to both of you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.